we're about to deep dive into trust as an opportunity, of course. And I know I don't have that much luck with country this morning, but we're about to review a very particular case. It's the Danish one, the Digital Republic of Denmark. Eva BERNEKE is CEO of KMD, and she's about to make the case for her own model. Denmark is close to 10 years ahead of France and Germany in terms of managing personal data and business. How come? Eva, you just joined us and you're about to tell us why.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's true. I think, like most Scandinavian countries, Denmark is one of the most trusting economies. If you look back in various surveys, Denmark typically come out on top. Actually, almost 80%, 78% of Danes are trusting somebody they don't know in the street. That compares to 10, 12% in African countries. And if you go just a bit south of Hamburg, it probably drops quite significantly. How does that trust translate into a digital economy? If you look at Denmark, we actually keep on to the first spot in the European Union, and that's likely to be among the top spots also in the global economy in terms of digital economies. That goes, and I haven't translated this, so you will be exercising your Danish here, but it goes across various categories. The darkest box up at the top is actually about digital public sector. So the trust is not only in one another, it is also trust in the digital economy, it's trust in the digital public sector. That provides a lot of opportunities, not only for the public sector to digitize, but also for the private sector to really leverage those digital opportunities. On the other hand, and that's something which is a bit more recent in terms of surveys, also about a quarter of Danes have issues with data security and are not fully trusting that the public sector or private companies fully securitize and handle their personal and sensitive data properly. How does that come together? You trust the next person you meet in the street, but you have a little bit of issue that the public sector or private company can actually handle your data with the amount of trust that you're giving them. I'll get back to it a little bit. I'll get back to some of the things, especially from a regulatory perspective, that the Danish government has been doing to drive this, but also a little bit to the opportunities that this amount of trust in public data and collection of public data actually gives to both public and private companies. So what has happened? This is actually a tale of more than 15 years of public sector strategies towards a more digital economy. Started back in 2001 with the first large public sector digital strategy, driving up against quite ambitious targets in terms of digitizing the economy. We just had the fifth this year, which for the first time, and this is actually interesting, it was only the fifth public sector digital strategy that had the word security in the title. So for the first four, this was all about driving digitization through more efficiency, better administration, and more growth. So what has been some of the steps that it's been taking? It's actually going back to quite ambitious targets and quite ambitious infrastructure projects also from the very beginning. Starting back in the early zeros with actually creating a digital signature. So all Danes today, except from the ones who have a either medical or age-related exemption, have a digital signature. They all have a digital e-box for electronic mails. So by regulation today, the public sector sends no more paper mail. Unless you are handicapped or an elderly, and that's around 8-10% today, everybody gets all mail from the public sector in an e-box. Has lots of advantages, also some discussions, but it's actually been regulation that has driven this progress. Everything you see which has an NEM means simple. So also a lot of infrastructure projects driving a simple login, a login that's used both for net banks, life and pension funds, and for the public sector, so you only have one set of codes, highly securitized. NEM account, that's the account you give to the public sector for all transfers in and out. That's where tax will get their, what you owe tax, and that's where all the transfer payments will go in. Today what we're moving forward is actually what we call the data hub, and I'll come back to that, which is the public sector also giving back the access to public sector data. And that's probably been over the last 3 to 4 years where the public sector in Denmark is also starting to say, all this fantastic data we collect from individuals, companies, geodata, traffic data, we'll open it up and we'll give it back for free. Come back to how that's possible, but that actually creates quite a lot of opportunities both for the private and public sector. How has this come together? I think at least 3 words are key to getting to a place like this. One of them is strong governance, extremely important, clear targets and legislation. Strong governance, you always get the money man to sit behind it. So the Ministry of Finance is behind all this, and the Agency of Digitization sits directly under the Minister of Finance, which means that when you do these nice admin business cases or provides opportunities, it gets worked into the budgets. It's a very effective way of trying to drive effective public sector. Clear targets, I think, is another very important one. Setting dates, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but in 2 or 3 years' time on when you're going to do things. So, for example, these E-days were days on which the public sector was required to either start accepting electronic mail or being required to only send electronic mails, so you avoided the paper trails. Or days where all citizens and companies in Denmark were required to get an e-box unless they got an exemption. So very clear targets on when we're going to move to these things, and actually somehow also having the courage, guts, whatever you want, to force digitize the economy. Really say, unless we do this by legislation, it's never going to move. And the last one, I think, is equally important. It has to do with forcing legislation, but also guidance on legislation. Because if you ask most politicians, it's not the first thing they think about when they do new regulation, new laws. It's not about, can this be digitized? So also turning it around and saying, when you do new legislation, when you do new regulation on, be it unemployment benefits, healthcare benefits, can it be digitized? Digitalization first, rather than the old analog, is actually one of the key things driving new legislation in Denmark. How do they then overcome some of these trust issues? Because we do have some very good prerequisites. It's a relatively small country, it's around 5.5 million people, highly educated, high levels of kind of comfort in new technology, very high trust in both in agencies like tax and ministries in general. And yet still a quarter of the population still say they do lack some trust in public sector IT. And that has to do with some, and I think that's inevitable, and I think that's just to be accepted when you move fast forward into the digital world. You will have issues. There will be issues where some government agencies fail to encrypt socially sensitive data and send it off to the wrong party. There will be areas where one of the banks have issues with some employees who leak data out to the press in one way or another. So you do need to deal with these lack in the way we actually treat data in the public sector. I think some of the keys to actually drive this is actually very early to show the advantages of it. We all know that individuals will deal differently with security. We all know how much we accept on our iPhone or our iPad if we see there's a value for us early on. If we see that this makes our life much more simple, people are willing to trade off security and trust against the value that's in it for them. But also, actually, early on, discuss and try to drive standardizations for public access to data, security levels, what's okay and what's not okay. And then finally, there's no way around also working on the citizens' general digital competences. The more you know, the better you also know how to deal with security. The more you know when not to click on a phishing email, when not to do certain things. And I think those are some of the key elements that actually a lot of both money and effort has been poured in over the last couple of years. So what are some of the business opportunities? I actually think there are huge business opportunities from both angles, both from existing businesses where banks, we just heard from AXA, insurance companies can actually draw in quite a lot of this public sector data and this open data into their current value chains and actually improve their business. And then of course we'll also see quite a lot of disruption into some of these. I think we all talk about disruption in the financial sector industry, we talk about it in transportation, so of course we will see a lot of new players coming in, totally breaking up the value chain. But all of them will be diving into this kind of big data integration analytics layer. Both if you want to make your own value chain in the existing businesses much more effective, or if you want to start a disrupting business that does things totally different, eliminating some of the more incumbent players, you'll need data integration analytics. And the way we have done this in Denmark, and this is actually, the green part is the public data, is that the public state is actually putting all their data in a one data hub. So they created the public sector data hub, integrating all kinds of public sector data. So you now have, and we're rolling in different registers, everything from key individual, housing, all kind of real estate, geodata, weather data, traffic data, various part on company data, into one single data hub. So in one single hub with one single API, you'll be able to access all the information that the public sector will have of you. Of course, there'll be a big security layer that says you can't get down to an individual basis in terms of seeing people sensitive, but at a certain level of adaptation, you'll be able to gain access to all of this. And we think that this will actually provide quite a lot of also private sector opportunities, be it banks, insurance companies who use geodata for better targeting of policies, be it telecom, be it agriculture. We actually see quite a lot of cases on even small and medium-sized agricultural units who are starting to use the weather data and some of the geodata much more effectively in order to drive productivity. So I think we'll see quite a lot of business opportunities once you figure out how to deal with security and how to expose all this public sector data in a very secure way. So I think that's my final words. Examples for some of the opportunities that trust and driving a very digital public sector strategy can give you in the economy.
Thank you so much, Eva. Thank you. Deserve some applause. Yeah, and our audience, both in this very room and on Twitter, is just amazed to see how much digitized Denmark is, and in advance, of course, when it comes to management of data, and also the fact that, again, government plays a strong role when it comes to data management. And it's maybe, when it comes to digital transformation, it's maybe likely to what's happening in firms, you know, where basically, you need strong management to impel the digital transformation strategy. Well, when it comes to data management, it's quite the same. I mean, you have a government which has to be strong, and mind is words when it comes to data management and the way it's going to handle it. So many thanks for this brilliant model. But Vincent has a question for you.
Yeah, first question. I mean, so Lego is really a success at my home. With my kid. What about KMD? I mean, can we expect to see you also in France, for instance, and try to catch up with Denmark?
KMD is actually a company that was created from the public sector. We were privatized around 6-7 years ago. So we were created around creating public sector IT infrastructure. So we built a lot of these systems for the public sector. Now, I know when I travel to France and other economies, there is a lot of envy in terms of how far we've gotten, but also learnings to be taken in terms of how do you deal with both 40 years of digitalization, because this was something started actually back in the 70s with some of the big transfer payment systems and brought up to now. So I've had a lot of dialogues with both French and some German and some Polish infrastructure. And I do see a lot of parallels in terms of the need for public sector to drive this, the need for public sector to agree on a strategy. Now, I'm not French, but I think there might be a little bit of way to go before all municipalities, regions, and the central government in France are entirely aligned on what to do on the digital economy, and especially probably in terms of the courage to move forward and say, guys, this is where we're going. It might be in 3 years' time, but in 3 years' time, no more paper, only electronic mail, or 3 years' time, not just 100,000 or 1 million or 5 million have a digital signature, but it's every French citizen and company who needs to do that, and that's the only way we'll be dealing with you. That kind of courage, I think, needs to come from the top. It's back to your point about leadership, but especially a somewhat courageous leadership that steps forward.
Courageous leadership. I love those two words. Well, actually, would you say that the multiplication of local government scales is constrained when it comes to, again, that implement of a strong data management policy?
Yes, it's clear that we see, and I think that will always be the case, differences between what central government thinks is the right way to move and the way the local municipalities want to move. And sometimes you even see the regions in between having a bit their own way of doing, because there is an element of self-preservation in some of this. Who owns the data? Sometimes you see some ministries who've started creating almost small business models for themselves in terms of how to drive, for example, the business agency, the geodata agency, and all of a sudden having to align to one centralized strategy is, first of all, a hassle, and second of all, might potentially change some of your more local strategies for things. You also see some of the cities, so especially the capital region has a somewhat different agenda from some of the smaller, more rural cities in terms of how to leverage big data. They're much more concerned about urbanization, smart city elements, where some of the smaller, more rural areas are much more concerned about supporting local businesses and how to leverage it for agricultural and small business purposes.
That was in fact my next question that you mentioned. It's a typical question: who owns the data? And especially you mentioned there is also private-public. So especially in that case, who owns the data? Is it the user or?
No, I think that's been the big step forward, is that the public sector in Denmark has said that the data, I mean, they might own the data, might collect the data, but they'll give it away for free to everybody who just collects it over the data hub. So there's no payment involved in Data Hub. So anybody who can figure out how to work up against an API can go in and access the data. And that's a big step forward, because that will enable also rather small companies to access data a way that only larger companies, the big banks, the big insurance companies could do before. I think that's quite innovative. That doesn't mean that everybody will do it and be able to use it the right way, but you will all of a sudden have a wealth of data for free there, where before you needed to go and pick them up in potentially 10, 12 different registers with different APIs into them, and potentially also payments attached to it.
Which means that it's definitely an open source model when it comes to the management.
It is. It's all open source.
So every single Danish citizen can access those hubs and, apply for an API that is going to maximize the effect and the efficiency of those data collected publicly.
Yeah, and you already see, and I'm not necessarily sure that it's going to be the individual citizen who do it, but you already see various startups. So, for example, your real estate tablet agent will be able to go in and out of the public sector data pick out, I'm looking for houses in the street. How much has been the sale value? What's been the sale in this street at what price over the last 10 years, to give you a benchmark of it? Because they're able to tap into the public sector real estate register and pick out the prices for the household, so it gives you a benchmark right away. And those kind of things, I don't think you'll do it as an individual when you're out shopping for your vacation home or your next house, but that the real estate agent portal will be able to do it for you, creates a huge amount of value for you.
But again, the most connected, the most vulnerable. So how do you ensure the security of those public data?
Yes.
And okay, again, it's a question of trust.
It's a question of trust, and it's also a question of providing digital competences. And we've actually seen a bit of a funny pattern, because we've seen actually quite a lot of older people in retirement moving strongly into the digital world. And it's a little bit about what creates digital trust. What creates value for a lot of the retirees has been that they'll be able to communicate much more freely with the family. So honestly, FaceTime has probably done more to digitization of the retiree population in Denmark than some of these strategies. But that has also meant that they actually moved in and acquired knowledge enough not to be afraid of also using these digital tools that are provided. But on top of it, we also have quite a lot of both voluntary and state-funded organizations that help support both building skills in the elderly population, but also just putting forward, as example, libraries today are more used for various digital help and support assistance. So you turn the public library into very much a support station where you both can get access to computers if you don't have it, internet access, but you can actually also get help to get on your e-box if you're not quite capable on getting there yourself.
Thank you so much, Eva, for your insights and perspective. Thank you so much, Vincent. It was an amazing, outstanding example. I think you deserve some applause.